Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. And what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. If you've been listening in, we've been active in some pretty big transformational processes these days, which got us thinking about how rare it is for people to speak on the actual nitty-gritty of being a human going through these kinds of moments. From what happens in the brain and the body when you're in the middle of healing, to what may pop up psychologically as you uproot the causes of your suffering. In this conversation, we're bringing some light to what it's been like to be up close and personal to our own active journey with internal transformation. If you're enjoying the show, there are a few ways you can help support us, which we would really appreciate. We would love it if you leave a review on iTunes. What this does is help more people find the show, and it feels really great to us. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to receive our blog and our weekly digest, or to find out more about becoming one of our supporting members on Patreon, which is so important to us. We are a donation-based podcast, and we're so appreciative of everyone who takes the time to head over there and donate to keep us going. Brooke and I also do see clients privately, so feel free to go to blissandgrit.com for more information on that. One last thing before we head into the conversation. On occasion, Brooke and I can curse, so just in case you're in mixed company, feel free to go ahead and pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Hello, Brooke.
Hey, Vanessa.
How you doing today?
I'm doing good. How you doing?
You know, I feel pretty good there, darling. My brain feels just a little slower than usual, but that might be a nice change of pace, mightn't it be?
It mightn't be. And me too. Also having a slow tail end of this virus day, so...
Actually, what I'm about to kick off the conversation on, when I was speaking to a friend about it, she was like, are you going to write a book? Because I guess that's how deep the information is we keep sharing.
I'm down.
We got that review where one girl's like, it's so much information per episode. And it's like, oh my God, it really is. Like, get your pen and your notebook out, everybody, because...
And the Friday newsletter is like, okay, here's 45 things we looked at this week. Not really. It's like 3 to 5, but still.
Yeah, I realized to a certain extent, this must be what it's like when really you're a researcher. You know, on a certain level, we're like experiential researchers.
Yeah, and synthesizers. So, we're always looking for like, what are the bridges between teachings and disciplines and Yeah,
and ultimately... for the sake of our own freedom, and then hopefully the freedom of others. Today, we're going to talk about like the nitty gritty of the transformation process. But, you know, just as a beautiful reminder container, Brooke, you and I were talking about this before. I was having a conversation with a listener and just saying, you know,
when we're talking about all of this stuff, the container really is that you and I are seeking like complete freedom from the causes of suffering, which is awakening, which is very different than a psychological process per se. You know, it might be different than the kind of work you do with a therapist. And there is nothing wrong with all the different ways we could come to know more love, more understanding, and feel more whole. But the conversations that we're generating to, because of where our fascination is and really the processes we're in, is we're curious, can we be free of all causes of suffering? Mm. And is it simply a matter of grace, you know, which we hear sometimes, like it comes or it doesn't come? Or is there something we can do about it? Mm-hmm. So for everybody who's been loyally listening on and on for a while with us, which we have so many of you, thank you. Big shout out to you. We adore you. You know that Brooke and I have been kind of heavy into our own processes for the last couple of months, really seeing if we can deconstruct both some limiting beliefs we have, but also some overactivation of our limbic system and our nervous system. And we've been really active in that process. So you probably all feel the same. We all go in and out of transformative phases. Like sometimes you're really in process. Sometimes you're just kind of sitting back and, you know, flowing a little more. Well, right now, Brooke and I are deep in the transformative process. And that got us thinking about, like, how often do you hear about the nitty gritty of what it's like to be a human going through a transformative process? And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about that today.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Let's see where this will go. But I know where it will start. So if you've been following us on Facebook or Instagram, if not, you know what to do. We'd love to see you there. But if you have, you may have saw me share some quotes from a book I've been reading about on how enlightenment changes the brain. And I came across a little section in that book that struck me as so important to understand for my own process that I wanted all of you to also have this knowledge so you can feel more empowered. So I think I'll begin the conversation by reading the quotes. Does that sound good, Brooke?
I love it. I'm into it.
Okay. So when we talk about the nitty-gritty of transformation, I think we can talk about it from two different sides at least. But there's the physiological aspect of what it's like to go through a transformative process. And then, of course, there can be the psychological aspect of what it's like to go through a transformative process. I'm going to kick us off in this conversation with a quote about our physiology and what we may encounter as we're going through a process of transformation. And let's just say transformation is not just the management of anxiety. Transformation is like a complete shift and alteration so that those patterns are no longer running. Would that be a fair definition
and I think
for our conversation?
A very helpful frame, getting to what you were saying at the beginning too. Like we're talking about total freedom, which includes our humanity, right? So not all the ideas of what we have about what total freedom looks like, but genuine freedom and not well-managed patterns.
Yeah, I mean, we have shared, but probably a long time ago, you know, one of our mentors used to talk to us about, you know, at first we can all feel like victims of circumstance in our life. And that's a phase that maybe some never get out of, maybe some do. But there's this sort of monumental achievement when as a human we start to recognize, oh my God, I'm not just a victim. I have some choice. And if I have some choice, I can choose the way I act right now. I can choose how I speak to people. If I'm stressed, I can choose to exercise instead of eat cookies, right? And so the birth of the notion of choice is huge developmentally. It's a really amazing maturational point for us to reach. And in that phase of healing, we often will use management strategies. Thank God for them. God bless. You know, we talk about them on the show all the time. Find the ground, get into bed. Those are 2 management strategies. Exercise, yoga, breathing, meditation, energy work, Rolfing. All of these things can be wonderful tools to help us meet and deal with and lessen and manage whatever symptomology is coming up, whether it's a voice in our head or whether it is low grade or chronic anxiety or terror or depression or whatever is arising for us. So again, wonderful. But then what our mentor broke down for us is then there's transformation, and transformation is almost getting to cause and effect. It's getting down to the roots of the kind of beliefs and thoughts and patterns and nervous system, wiring that is keeping us with suffering constantly arising, right? Or being triggered so easily from our environment. So transformation is like, how can we get to the root and uproot it or rewrite this or really release this and be done with this? And that is a much more interesting experience. Well, interesting is not the right word, but interesting in the sense that it's not so clear cut.
Yeah. And
right?
more, I was going to say unusual, but these days anyway, more rare, although hopefully becoming less and less rare.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you guys have heard some of the awakened teachers that we interview on our show, and there's many different ways people can speak about it, but by and large, you'll hear something to the effect of it's a complete shift of identity, like a complete shift of identity.
Right.
It's not a going back and forth. It's not sometimes I know I'm the light. Sometimes I think, I'm a clunky, horrible human.
Right. You should be doing a better job at whatever.
Yeah, just whatever your thought process is. It is like a complete and total shift of identity. That's one kind of transformation. But perhaps if you go from somebody who has a lot of self-doubt or shame to somebody who really is free of that and knows that you're loved and knows that you're lovable and knows that you are loved, that also is a transformation. Maybe you believe you're undeserving and you come to know I'm utterly deserving, implicitly deserving. That's a transformation. So that's a great container for what we're talking about. So with that in mind, let's start to look at some of the nitty-gritty of what it can feel like to be a human going through a transformative process as told by our personal experiences, knowing we're just 2 people going through it. Okay, here's the quote. Your everyday consciousness will initially resist any attempt to alter your sense of reality because it requires a lot of metabolic energy for the brain to accept and integrate new experiences, especially those that might change your beliefs and your perception of reality. Also, the human brain doesn't like ambiguity or surprises. It's willing to go after pleasurable experiences, but anything new and intense stimulates the danger circuits in your brain, we could also say the amygdala or the limbic system, that are designed to shut down the higher states of consciousness, creativity, and imagination. So let's just begin there. And I just want to give us 2 words that we can use to put this into context, is that another way we could describe this is that whenever the brain is faced with cognitive dissonance, aka a new belief or a new perception that challenges an old belief or an old perception. So the brain is almost holding a paradox, like it's holding these 2 things at once. Whenever the brain is confronted with that, it's called cognitive dissonance. The brain's like, hey, wait, this doesn't match. And when something doesn't match and it's required to update itself, it's required to go through a process of change, it actually requires a lot of metabolic energy, or we could say glucose, since that's one of the building blocks that the brain uses, in order to go through a process of transforming. And so sometimes what will happen is the brain will actually be in resistance to that in a very simple, primal, self-preserving way. It's really making judgment calls about how much metabolic energy it has available to it. And so I think this is a really interesting thing to be aware of as we're in our transformative processes, don't you?
Yeah. And we bring it up not to feed the fear demon, right? Like it's going to be hard. It's going to be relentless. It's going to be exhausting because our minds can go there pretty quickly. Or if your mind is anything like mine, those of you listening, my mind likes that particular branch of thinking. So we're not bringing it up to sort of glorify the struggle and how hard and intense it is. Instead, what a relief to know that if you're somebody who's engaged in a process of transformation, that you can just be really tender with yourself about the fact that cognitive dissonance will arise. There will be demands on the soma, demands on the body that will include fatigue. And then we don't have to get engaged in the boxing match internally of, why am I so exhausted? Why is this so hard? What's wrong with me? And then, of course, an all-time favorite, it will be like this forever. Now the new me is going to be chronically exhausted and always up against some edge of transformation. And, I'm somebody that for the last 2 years in particular, it's been a lot of cognitive dissonance to the point that sometimes life gets kind of confusing. Simple things are out the window, like the ability to mentally mark where I parked my car in my parking garage for work. Nope. Doesn't happen anymore for years. And so every time I walk into the parking lot at the end of a work day, I just have to trust that my body is going to lead me to the car because there's no mental imprint of it's the second floor on that side of the garage. So that's a little challenging. So I will say that as somebody that's been going through a lot of cognitive dissonance, it hasn't been, the picture can get painted so easily like it must be a constant grind. It's more like there are these openings, and I wouldn't say contractions, although contractions can happen, but what we're talking about more is kind of like a wind drag, where the body just genuinely needs some more rest. You were saying before we started recording, Vanessa, it's like when it was finals week in college, you're more tired. You actually feel like your brain is tired because there's a demand being placed on the system that's incredibly tangible. Learning creates a demand, a caloric demand, a glucose demand. So this is something that ebbs and flows. And the process that, for those who haven't been listening, that you and I have been playing with really tangibly recently is DNRS, or Dynamic Neural Retraining Systems. And for me, it's been fascinating at this stage to have a super consistent practice that I'm committed to for an hour a day for 6 months. And to see, it's like I'm able to kind of slow motion watch a transformation, because there's been lots of transformation like there is in any human life. And I would say the last couple of years have been extreme transformation for me. And now it's like I get to really zoom in with this particular process. And so there will be things like fatigue. There will be things like, I have a lot of awareness on my patterns just because of the path I'm on, but wow, total next level. Like you were saying in the beginning, when it comes to something totally resolving, total transformation, there's a place that you get to where the layer that you're at is so almost gauze-like. It's so fine. It was not perceived until something, in this case, the practice of DNRS, shifted enough of awareness that it's like, oh, and I can see the bits that are left of what I had mentioned in, I think, our last episode, the bits that are left of victim martyr, or suffering or shoulds. Thank God, as this happens, the increase in awareness and the increase in the demand of my actual body to transform, there's also these little peekaboos at the other side, of being without these patterns, because that's the only way. That's what cognitive dissonance feels like for me, right? I have something to compare it to. Before it just was. If it's the only frame of reference that you have, it just is your isness. But if you suddenly start to be having an other experience next to what your normal experience is, which differs from it, you're like, oh. And then you can see what you used to just call you at these very subtle layers. Have you been having some of that experience?
Yeah, I know what you mean, but my brain is caught up in like all sorts of examples of exhaustion.
Well, we can go for examples for exhaustion.
No, but I understand what you mean. And to me, reading that kind of quote, it felt very loving to have that information for myself, because if I mark some of the moments of big change that I've gone through, I might notice that right after I was exhausted. Now, so much of our experience of reality is based on our expectations and our perceptions, right? So if we have the perception that transformation looks like I have this profound moment, and then I easily integrate it and I am up-leveled and ta-da, which sometimes it does. But if that's our model for it, and instead what happens is I have a tremendous epiphany, a tremendous breakthrough, and then I wind up needing to sleep for like a week straight, then my mind goes, something went wrong here. Mm-hmm. And I think understanding this is very loving, because I remember when you and I did Judith Blackstone's certification process, when you go to a training like this, okay, it's not just you're sitting there meditating. P.S. I'm usually tired after meditation retreats too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But it's not, what it really is you in a room finding places in your body that formerly you may not have ever inhabited or may not have felt safe inhabiting. It's confronting some of the painful narratives or limiting constrictions that you're holding in your body and your being. And so there is this process of new paradigm, new perspective, new energy, new experience coming in and meeting the old scripts, the old constrictions, the old narratives. And it's quite intense. And at the end of these weeks, you and I would be exhausted. Mm-hmm. And then we used to wonder what we did wrong in them.
Right. Because we're all conditioned in the, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? And actually, I remember Judith saying, she gave a great example, because I had an experience when we were training there, or maybe sometime in between the two chunks, the two modules of training, where something really let go in my heart area, and it felt like somebody had been taking a little mallet on the inside of my rib cage all the way around. Like, it was just so sore, so achy after this big release, and the big release felt euphoric, but then there was this actual achiness and fatigue, extreme fatigue. And I remember Judith saying, like, well, if you had spent 40 years clenching one hand in a fist if you unclenched that fist, it would be pretty tired and sore for a while. Like, there's a way that as you're clenching it, it just becomes the clenched thing, and your awareness is just not paying attention to it. But then when it does something different, unclench, it's like, ooh, that's tired, that's achy. Mm-hmm. And, she was speaking directly to the way that the very subtle microfascial impingements let go. But because she's Judith, right? She's also talking about energy and like how that moves in a system. It's so fatiguing to bind energy. But when you first release the bind, what you notice is fatigue. And it takes a while to upgrade and integrate the unbound as something other than unfamiliar. And also just to play catch up a little if we're talking about actual binds in the tissue. That's
interesting. I like that. I mean, the the biggest night and day moment I had was when last year I was in Matt Kahn's retreat, and it was the first time we'd ever met him in person. We were at 1440, and I had lost this chronic daily experience of shame and what did I do wrong and what am I missing that had basically been with me my whole life, just managed well. And I didn't experience fatigue after that. And it really never came back the same way. It really never did. Still, I may have self-doubt sometimes. But this was different. It was like something that took up space in my being that was constantly, chronically running all the time. But what I did notice was immediately some of that like amygdala pattern that this guy pointed to came on, because it was almost like I became euphoric in the absence of feeling chronic shame and anxiety about myself. And then the part of me that must have been keeping that pattern running, because it must have thought that was the safe and advisable thing to do, was like, ring the alarm bells. You look like a goofy idiot. Like, this is going to go really bad. You're too happy, you know? And I think that's a little bit about the psychological process, right? And so it's like when you're in the nitty gritty of change, there's all sorts of things that can happen. And honestly, who can say if it's the brain going, oh my God, this is using up too much glucose. Can you just not change? And it shows up in the voice of like a sub-personality going, Vanessa, you're being too goofy. Or if it is an actual psychological aspect of self, right? Because whatever pattern we're in the middle of exploring and hoping to create some transformation around, rest assured that pattern was created because it was the best thing you could come up with given what you believed to be true about yourself and the world and what was available to you. So, you know, as we're going through these processes of transformation, it's just like in the brain, it can be considered scary. It's certainly exhausting, right? It's exhausting to the brain. You may have plenty of energy for other things, but you may find your thinking is less sharp. You may find you need more sleep. Like that's what we're talking about. And it makes perfect sense. It makes sense when you understand the physiology. Like we said, you're studying for finals, you use a ton of glucose. That's why you might have eaten Twizzlers and drank Coca-Cola when you're in college studying, you know. Physiologically, that makes sense. And then psychologically, you know, we're unhooking these narratives that were created in our best attempt to have the best version of reality we could, given the variables we thought we were up against, right? That, you know, are not usually what we're still up against as an adult, usually, thank God, right? So I remember when we used to be at Matt Kahn's retreats, and at a couple of them, Matt said things to the effect of like, what's the number one tool you can use? He always makes it sound like it's going to be some really amazing
high drama rollout.
Answer.
What the number one thing?
What should the light workers do? And then he's like, rest, which is, of course, so anticlimactic for all of us people who want more. We want to do more, change more, be more. And it's like, you just need to rest. That's how you integrate this. You need to rest. And I'd hear him say that, and I'd think, oh, yeah, rest. But then I think my concept of rest might have been like, get a good night's sleep. Right? I think my concept always fell short of what I'm now perceiving I actually need. Because since I started DNRS, I don't drink a lot. Brooke doesn't drink at all. But I would have alcohol, I don't know, maybe once a week, once every couple of weeks. I can't have that right now. My brain is like, no.
I'm busy.
Go. Yeah, like I am really busy and I can't manage that stressor on top of this, right? It's about how many stressors your brain, your body, your nervous system can tolerate at once. And it's like I am full blown in this process of deconstructing and reconstructing. And I can't handle other stressors. It would move into like an immediate hangover. It just makes no sense for my mind anymore. And I find, I don't know if you've noticed this, Brooke, I mean, I can sleep like 9 hours a night. I mean, I can sleep. Like there's a time in my life when you know you're being lazy because, you know, your body maybe wakes up at 7 and then you're like, I just want to go back to sleep. And it's like I'm either feeling lazy or I'm feeling depressed. I don't want to get out of bed. No, this is different. Like, I go to sleep, and if my alarm doesn't go off, I'm not waking up for 9 hours. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we could have more perspective of trusting what arose in our body as valid information, we wouldn't get caught in trying to do things differently than they are and then judging ourselves if we can't, which is why I think this conversation was so potent for me to bring forward, because what I would go through is like, well, I want to think greater than I feel. I want to act like a person who's healthy because I'm working on reclaiming health and all these things. So I shouldn't need a lot of sleep, and I should be able to exercise every day, even though I'm meditating an hour a day. And I can't. I keep losing that battle. Mm-hmm. And so then it's like, oh, this understanding let me soften into, well, if I was just to trust my body instead of seeing my body as this entity that never has the right information, but trust that if it's tired, there's probably a very good reason and it requires rest. What would that be like? Mm-hmm. How much softer would that be? And how much less judgment and shame and fear and just quite frankly, wheel spinning will I have to get into, where I keep trying to do more than is actually available for me at any given time.
Yeah. And maybe I can speak a little bit to the other end of that spectrum, because so like things that I have to like catch up on in case people haven't heard it. And I'm like, so had a few realizations, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So those of you who have not listened, those of you who have, I apologize for saying it again, but there was a year, 3 big realizations, and then went into, what was basically my amygdala freaking out. Like it was too much cognitive dissonance, and I wasn't really functional. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because what I had to discern ultimately was like how much of this is the need for rest, which was absolutely true and was there. And I'm so glad for every moment that I spent laying on my floor or sleeping in my bed in that like year, where there was 5 months where it was very acute, 5-6 months. That was totally non-optional. And it wasn't because of anything I was doing wrong. Like had I found DNRS sooner, like, right, like the narratives go that way. Rest was a legitimate piece of that puzzle. And there was a piece of the puzzle that was just a trigger on a lifelong pattern of having some limbic impairment because of a birth injury, because of trauma, all the things that come together, the little cocktail that comes together to make that happen in a person's system. And so it's sort of related to what I was saying earlier in the call, where like things, you get to such a fine layer, like teasing apart, okay, well, how much of this is a system that needs to rest? That's true. And I need to just let it rest because I don't get to choose. That was non-optional. And then the mind, being able to be aware of the mind's narratives of doom, right? Like I'll be like this forever. I must be really, my main one was I must be really fucked up. And that just running in the background, which has been running in the background since forever, so I don't notice it. Those were things that held in place this limbic pattern, chronic dorsal vagal activation, whatever you want to call it, that was just in my nature. And so there is this dance. Certainly in our culture, most of us are overstriving the hell out of overstriving. And we could all welcome a hell of a lot more rest. And if it starts to become laced with a little doom waft of how you must be really fucked up, or this might last forever, there's just if that comes up to awareness, be aware there might be something else going on. And so now that I'm doing the DNRS practice, it's interesting because I do require more rest since I started. I'm back to like almost daily naps, happily. And I don't have the non-functional aspects where I'm feeling a lot of weakness in the limbs, or and the doom loop isn't underground anymore. So if it boots up, I hear it instead of it just being the thing that feels like me. And so being able to have a practice where I can feel something other than what has always felt like me, it creates cognitive dissonance, which creates a load on the system that it needs to metabolize. But it's also the exit door so that it doesn't just loop. So I just want to bring that forward. If there are people who are listening who have chronic fatigue or who've been in and out of bouts of depression, and hearing this feels like scary and precarious. The scary precarious is a sign there's something here in the nervous system that could stand to be healed and exposed through a really thoughtful practice, which is why we're using DNRS, at the same time that you get the rest that you need as you are genuinely and deeply transforming. Does that help, or does that muddy the waters?
No, I feel like there's a seed I want to get out of it, but I can't think of what my question is. I think in the end you brought it home, but I was just trying to differentiate. Are you saying that if you notice that along with the need for rest, there comes this soundtrack? Because especially, you and I can relate to it. Like, if you're not feeling well to begin with, and then all of a sudden you go into a transformative process, whether you're doing psychotherapy or meditation or DNRS or whatever you're doing.
Suddenly you see your God, whatever.
Yeah. And then you're like, what? More tired, more fatigued, right? Which can,
it can trip that like I am doomed,
And then it can trip that wire. So that for you, what's been helpful is that when you can see that wire tripped, it's helpful now to realize you're also in a very thoughtful process of transformation, so that whatever's happening, it's not going to be like this forever.
Right.
Did I understand you right?
Yeah, that I can't just very quickly and very unconsciously take that bait, which makes it sound like something I'm doing on purpose, but it really is just it's the program that runs. So having the context of I'm in a transformative process, being able to see examples of people who've come to the other side, which are most of the people who we talk to on the show, who live these vital, delightful, thriving lives, and they go through periods of upgrade where they nap more, and then they, come back out and live their life. That's very helpful. And this understanding of the nervous system, game-changing, totally game-changing, because it's not what's wrong with me, which leads into I'm doomed, and I'm the one who's uniquely fucked up, which is just a lot of the sort of scaffolding that my identity was built on when I was younger. Well, then it can't hook in. And then I get to actually, instead of it holding in place all the old conditioning, all the old shame, I'm able to have it being the exhaustion, right? Like instead of the fatigue holding in place all of that muck, I have a container for it just being something that is a great news and has certain requirements, which for me includes rest and neural repatterning at the same time.
Yeah, that's clear. That's really interesting. I think you bring in a good point there too, in that it certainly helps to have a model or a vision for somebody who has gotten to the other side, or some personal vision that feels really significant. Because it's easy for us to lose our way. And, if you really listen to what that quote was saying in the neuroscience behind transformation, fear gets triggered, limiting beliefs get triggered, our identity gets triggered. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. Whatever stories our brain is holding on to, whatever heuristic models and associations it formed, they come to feel like us, right? And the brain is holding on to that as an identity. And maybe it's not just the brain, right? Maybe it's our consciousness or our mind as well. I don't know. But just to speak about the brain, is holding on to that. So it takes this kind of leap of faith. And it's funny when you and I talk about, I used to think spiritual was a little bit different than talking about the body. I never found them to be so perfectly integrated. And now I'm like, oh my God, it's so integrated. It's so one and the same. When we talk about in spiritual circles, like having to take a leap of faith or, finding courage and everything, I'm like, oh my God, the leap of faith is believing that you can go from one state to another. Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting thing. It feels super vulnerable to have a leap of faith. Like when he describes that on some level, the brain will resist, and there are a couple more quotes I didn't read that reflect this, but on some level, the brain will resist changing, even if change seemingly is positive, because it doesn't know it's easier to stay from a metabolic perspective, from a resources perspective, the way it is, right? And so how that gets felt for me, and it may be that causes it, or maybe it's a psychological process, but it's a little vulnerable to believe I can change something. There is something weirdly easier and more comforting for me to move into acceptance. Mm-hmm. Well, this is life now, and now I will adjust to this, whatever this is. I will see my depression as a gift. I will see my illness as the way through, and then maybe one day life will grace me with not illness, or, whatever the case may be. It's easier on some level to accept it than to nurture a seed, which is the process you and I are in, that says, maybe it could be different, mm-hmm. right? Maybe I accepted and inherited a bunch of faulty understandings about the world. And maybe my body has been running in overdrive because it believes these scripts I created. I'm a victim, I'll never have what I want. No one will love me, whatever the script is. And maybe that's keeping my nervous system chronically running, because if that's reality, that's a pretty stressful reality, right? Mm-hmm. Makes sense. My nervous system would run. So then maybe I can thoughtfully, using my awareness and my consciousness, shift, create a new vision for myself and therefore a new life. That feels really vulnerable. Isn't it weird? I mean, you would think it should just easily feel more hope-inducing. Who doesn't want to be out of whatever you feel to be your predicament? But that's not how it feels to me in the middle of the nitty-gritty of transformation. It's like, even to talk about it, I've been able to reflect back, and ever since we started talking about this, like DNRS and can we co-create, and like where do we have agency and where is it grace and just left up to the spiritual forces of reality and whatnot, I feel like it's more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. It's easier to just fall into acceptance, and it's easier to talk about acceptance. It's tricky to talk about, can I change things? In part because, well, we've all changed things in our life. We all have. But it's like, I don't know, it puts me in the center of it. What if I don't succeed? What if I can't do it? And so you notice that it requires this leap of faith, and it requires a little bit of courage, even though it shouldn't seem that way. It sure does in my process. And so when we have models of people that have gone through that journey and come through in a new emergent state, I think it's helpful. I think it's why, like DNRS, they give you so many testimonials to help you walk that road. Or if somebody, I know a few listeners who are into Joe Dispenza's work, and he'll give tons of testimonials and tons of stories. And when we went to the Science and Non-Duality Conference, if any of you have heard Jeannie Zandy speak on our show, Jeannie's, quite verbose about how she had a dark night of the soul, and it was terrible, and she didn't feel good, and she was like on her knees, and it was like a really intense thing. If you saw Jeannie today,
oh man, she's just sweetness and honey and light all over the
vibrancy,
place.
Like vibrancy and energy and like love and light, and she's gorgeous. And if anyone listened last week to how much I want to be hotter, I mean, how embarrassing is that? Someone reminded me of it because I forget everything.
I know, I forget what we record, and sometimes people bring it up. I'm like, oh, I'm talking about that in public, huh? Okay, yeah, interesting choice.
Like, oh, I admitted that out loud, huh? So I think it is really nice for us to have a new vision for whatever it can be, because whatever pattern we're in the middle of grappling with, that was not created overnight. And it was created, either as a result of a physical implication, but some spiritual teachers who would point to life being a mirror would say it always comes back to some belief we were either handed, inherited, or something we've created. I'm not totally sure about that. I'm not speaking about that from a level of experience, because I know the body plays a part and I don't know this all inside and out yet. But, however it got created for its own good reason, its own survival and preservation of you.
Yeah, and I have found it incredibly helpful to keep that in mind for myself and with my clients as well. You and I say a lot on the show, and it's one of Matt Kahn's awesome things that he says all the time is like in innocence, right? These things are created in innocence. And in intelligence, there was a real intelligence that these things got created in. And even if it was, because so much of our conditioning is handed to us from the outside world, girls are polite and they smile a lot, and that's how they get loved. Like, that's handed to us from the outside. But then the intelligence says, oh my God, like for my species, the way that I don't get shunned, the way that I get to survive, claim a space to exist and get love and worth and value is I'm polite and I smile. That's what the female sex of this species does in order to survive. So even that, which is totally handed to us from the outside, we claim it because the choice is, it seems like a good survival choice then. Yeah. If that's what I'm being told.
Because we believed it.
At a very, very, very young age. And being handed to us by people that 1,000% believe that is true. Because otherwise they wouldn't hand it to us. That's why it got passed down. So as these things get unbound and as I get to the subtle layers, we talk a lot about how do we bring tenderness to them? How do we love whatever arises, which is Matt's beautiful book. But it's become so intimate that I can see each little thought form or piece of an identity structure. And when it arises, that I can greet it with love and with respect and with intelligence. And like you were saying earlier, say to it, man, you must be tired. I feel your tiredness. That shit is tiring to run that belief system all the time. And just to try and give it the sense experientially, like you could relax. Like there could be a way that you're absorbed into something larger and more nourishing and that feels a lot easier. Like, do you want to go tubing with me? Get in the river. Let's do this thing, right? And those little micro conversations that happen with conditioning have been so helpful because it just removes the warfare. And certainly, like so many of the teachers we've talked to bring this up. Matt wrote a whole book about it. But I'm just saying that like the dance of being able to actually do that and to really see, not just to say like, I love you, now go away, which is the habit that separate self does initially, but to have utter regard for the innocence and the intelligence that adopted that piece of conditioning, and so much empathy for how exhausted it must be to keep holding on to that belief and to invite something else that can happen.
Yeah, I found that still works so much better for me. I mean, sometimes I could just turn away from a thought, or I don't have, like let's say, for example, when we say turn away from a thought, it'll be like, let's say, look, your foot is hurting and now your head's hurting. How come no one else is sick? You're sick. All right. So I'm working on my health. And so that kind of thought, sometimes I'm like, okay, just focus my attention elsewhere. Right.
That's like notice how delicious the warm tea tastes, right? Like you can go to a different sensation. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I can go to a different body part. I can go to a different thought process, and I can just shift attention. But I'm not having a ton of just random thoughts popping up. What I am noticing is when they come up, it is more like an aspect, a subpersonality, the part of me that formed the belief at whatever point that I was injured or whatever point that I accepted it from my world or from my parents or whatever it is that's coming up. And I have found the easiest thing to do is just to love it. Like, it's not a turn away. It really is just oh, sweetie. It really is just what we've always known to do, because it softens it so much. It's like I don't have to accept whatever limiting belief that part is holding, because when you talk about that, what I've noticed as I start to explore this in myself is however our reality got structured, whatever it's based on, it seems to be very dualistic. So like the example you gave, Brooke, it's like, okay, well, if good girls are polite and nice, then if you're not polite and nice, nobody thinks you're good and nobody wants to be around you. And it's this very like, if this, then that, and very dualistic. And that aspect of experience that formed, the constriction that formed, it doesn't have any sense of paradox, any sense of
no gray, nuance at all.
No nuance. Yeah,
no
it's
subtlety.
Like, boom, the seed of dualism. Either I do this or I do that. So then that part, I mean, if that's reality, if that was in fact reality, that if you were not a good girl, you would never, ever, ever get human contact and love. Well, I mean, for me, I'd probably choose to be a good girl and have some contact and love, right?
That's a very intelligent choice.
It would be a very intelligent choice. So when I can see that part, I don't have to believe it's belief. I don't have to say, you're right, you have to be good, right? I'm not entertaining the mythological narrative, but I am going, oh, honey, wow, come here. Let's look at it another way. There are all these shades of gray, and you can have a different experience altogether than what you got. And that is the quickest, easiest, most relevant, most alive, softening agent I can find within myself. And I think that's why our conversations, I don't know what they're like to listen to for someone else, but I'm sure it can be a little weird because it's so nuanced and it's so intense. But the truth of it is no one can write this for you in a book. It really is so important that it's experiential. Like, you can't even listen to us and go, okay, so I'm going to rest more. It's like, no, maybe you don't need to rest more. Maybe you already sleep 12 hours a day and you need to get up and go for a walk. And that's what your divine intelligence would tell you. It's like, there really is no guidebook, but there are some pointers that we can keep in mind for sake of understanding and having expectations that, like, transformation's challenging. It challenges us physiologically. That's why we may rock back and forth a lot. Glimpses back. Good news is that when I read this book on enlightenment in the brain, from what this guy studied, is every glimpse structurally changes your brain and it doesn't go backwards again.
Yeah, I can say that's true. Right, even though there's contractions, you never go back to.
You never go backward. You don't readopt an old perspective. You never lose the perspective gained. Structurally, that's freaking
very cool.
Mm-hmm. But you may start to re-identify with a part, or you may cling to a habit or a behavior or a thought form, but perspective gained is never, ever lost. That's really cool. So we can understand all of this. And really, I use it because, I don't know, especially since lately, Brooke, we're talking about things like creation and beliefs and like, is there something to the law of attraction or the law of cause and effect that feels to us like very genuine, very alive, and very non-egoic. All of these explorations, I guess it feels more important for me to point this out because when you hear about these things spoken about in popular culture, at least the way I've always heard them, it always, in my mind, makes it seem so easy.
Yeah. Well, we have before and after picture culture, right? Before, after. And it's like, what about after the after? And what the fuck happened between before and after?
How many times were you on your knees? Like, I can't tell you how many times my brain is still producing, thought patterns that are reflective of my past, even though my whole intentionality and my whole awareness is going towards the future, right? Like, I'm doing that consciously, and unconsciously here it comes creeping in. Like, the actual process of transformation has quite a bit of nitty grittiness to it. And if we don't understand that, that's where I think it gets easier to think you're doing something wrong. It'll never work for you.
Yeah. The fallback is always shame, because we're just also heavily conditioned in it. So,
or you might give up what you're trying because you think, oh, this isn't working.
It's hopeless. Yeah.
It's hopeless and I think if we can have this larger perspective of what it means to be a human on a journey of transformation, to say, hey, great news. Every perspective is never lost. The other great news, everyone's as far as this neuroscientist can tell, and I really believe this in me, with everything I have, everyone's brain can transform. Mm-hmm. Everyone's brain can awaken. Everyone has that same potential. So then that's really interesting. Right? That's all great news. And you and I, I'm tired now. I was really speaking about the need for rest, and I still have thoughts that crop up. And sometimes it's hard to get myself to meditate an hour a day, which is surprising because it's quite delightful.
Right.
But I think it's because of what we're pointing at. Even with all of that, I don't have baseline anxiety at all anymore. I don't have that at all. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. I'm much happier, and I feel really engaged in the process instead of feeling a little helpless and hopeless.
Yeah, adrift on the seas of transformation. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel really engaged, and I feel more connected to myself, and I feel more connected to life, and I feel more connected to people. It just keeps deepening my sense of empathy and understanding for others. So there's so much greatness that's unfolding in the midst of this. It's just helpful to know wherever you're at. When I did EMDR, if you're doing EMDR or psychotherapy or a Rolfing series or energy work, wherever you are in your transformative journey, be really kind to yourself. TLC just becomes really important. It becomes legitimately, physiologically important for all the reasons we mentioned. The neurobiological ones and the psychological ones, because, you're having to dig deep to find faith and courage.
Yeah. Well said.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. And this is where you can go donate, keep the show rolling, and also get some rewards for your support. If you're wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, that's a great place to go for a more immersive experience. You can also come play with us on Instagram and Facebook. Or subscribe on the website, which is blissandgrit.com, to get our weekly digest of what resources we're currently loving. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned in this episode, live on the website. And if you go there and scroll down, you'll see each episode's separate post. And we put the resources right in there. I know we give a lot of them sometimes, so we make sure to write them down for you. We're so grateful to each and every one of you for the membership support you've provided, for the notes you send, for the social media comments, and for the reviews you've written, such as this lovely review from Atalia Egerton, who says, I love this podcast and these amazing two women. I find much nurturance from every episode. It's my number one listen. Thank you so much, Atalia. And thanks to all of you for all the listening and engaging. Till next week.